Have you thought about joining a fitness center? Did you know that to join a fitness center, you will most likely need to sign a contract? Before you sign that contract, there are a few things you should consider. Visit the fitness center. Plan to visit the facilities before making a decision and look at the hours of operation, equipment, classes, staff, and cost. Inquire if you can try out the facility on a guest pass and go when you would normally work out so you can see how available machines or classes are. Most centers have several membership plans. Costs per year for a new membership vary depending on the type of services desired, and ask if there are any annual or one-time fees. Also, be sure to inquire about any discounts that may be available. Read the contract before you sign. Once you have made a decision on a location, you may be asked to sign a contract to join. Review this contract carefully. Yes, that means read the entire document. Look at the length of the contract and billing procedures. Keep in mind that after signing, you may have only 3 days to change your mind and cancel the contract. What are the cancellation policies? Can you get a refund if you move to another city in the middle of the contract? Ensure that the contract covers all of the services you plan to use, since some items may cost extra. Review this membership agreement carefully to understand all company policies. Know your protections. Under Wisconsin law, fitness center contracts must contain a 3-day cancellation right so new members can think about and cancel the membership if they wish. The law also requires the contract to disclose the full membership price, available locations, and any conditions or restrictions on their use. If a facility or service becomes unavailable at any time during the length of your contract, you are entitled to a partial refund. If a center collects more than $100 in advance of providing fitness center services, it is required to have financial proof of responsibility filed with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. To check if your center has filed, email datcphotline@wisconsin.gov. Following these tips will help ensure that you can enjoy using the fitness center without any surprises popping up in the middle of your membership. Learn more by enrolling in Consumer Protection 101 by subscribing to our YouTube channel or following us on social media. More resources are available on the Consumer Protection 101 webpage at www.datcp.wi.gov.